Hi. Hi, everybody. Welcome along to our press conference today. My name is David McNeil. I'm your MC today, and I'm a member of the event committee of the FCCJ. Our speaker today is Thomas Andrews. He is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. As most of you in the room probably know, it's not a happy situation at all. I'll just read out the notice. Despite once promising signs of democratic buds flowering, Myanmar is increasingly a black hole for human rights. 2 years after a coup d'etat ended a brief democratic experiment, the country is in freefall, says Mr. Andrews. That's in his report. The military has doubled down on its brutal tactics. He says, sowing violence and chaos, bombing villages, schools, medical facilities, and encampments for internally displaced persons. More than 1.4 million people have been displaced in the past 2 years, and more than 3,400 civilians have been killed. Thousands of journalists and activists, of course, I see some familiar faces in the room, so you'll know this, have been arrested or detained. There may even be some of you who have been detained in the country. Some have been executed. Torture and abuse of detainees has been widely reported, and of course the ethnic Rohingya people have been intimidated or killed, and many live in camps without access to the basic needs of life. So all of that means that there is no shortage of work for the man sitting beside me here, of course, and no shortage of things to talk about today. Mr. Andrews is a former US congressman. He was appointed to the rapporteur post in 2020. He is a Robina Senior Human Rights Fellow at Yale University Law School, an associate of Harvard University's Asia Center, and he has a Washington, D.C. based consulting practice called Andrews Strategic Services. So I'll get out of the way as always, as quickly as I can, and I'll let the man himself talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and happy Golden Week. I wanted to tell you that it really is an honor and pleasure for me to be here with you today. And I'm going to, I've just completed my mission, and I have a mission statement that I would like to read, and then I'd be very happy to answer any and all questions. It is an honor and a privilege for me to be visiting Japan in my capacity as United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. And I want to extend my heartfelt and sincere thanks to the government of Japan for inviting me here and facilitating meetings with the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, Immigration Services Agency, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, and the Special Advisor to the Prime Minister for Human Rights Issues, His Excellency General Nakatani. I also want to thank the Japanese parliamentarians, business leaders, human rights and humanitarian organizations, independent experts, and many Myanmar nationals living in Japan who provided me with important information while sharing valuable perspectives and insights. I also want to thank the Center for Southeast Asian Studies for hosting me and facilitating my lecture at Kyoto University. I came to Japan because the human rights situation in Myanmar is horrific, and it is getting worse. And because I believe that Japan has an essential role to play in helping to resolve this crisis. Japan's historic and economic ties to Myanmar and its position as a leading democracy in Asia put it in an excellent position to help develop a principled, human rights-focused regional response to the crisis in Myanmar. In a few weeks, Japan will host the G7 summit. I commend the foreign minister and the G7 foreign ministers who met in Japan last week for their strong statement on Myanmar. Their description of the deteriorating situation in Myanmar is both accurate and sobering, and I enthusiastically support their call to end the flow of weapons into the country. The deteriorating situation in Myanmar demonstrates that the international community's response to this crisis is failing, and it is failing the people of Myanmar. I believe it is time for the international community to undertake a fundamental reassessment of how we are responding to this crisis and make a course correction before it is too late. During my trip, I extended this call to the Japanese government, noting specific actions that I believe will help to make meaningful progress toward ending Myanmar's tragic downward spiral. Based on my conversations over the past 2 weeks, I am concerned that the Japanese public, as well as some business leaders, are not aware of the true depth of the horror that continues to unfold in Myanmar. Over 2 years ago, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing launched an illegal coup after a military-backed political party was soundly defeated in a democratic election. He seems to have severely underestimated the resolve of the Myanmar people to prevent a return to military rule. In the 2+ years since the coup, the military's violence and oppression has not only failed to suppress this dissent, it has deepened resentment against the junta and catalyzed a national opposition movement. Violence and the threat of violence has become a part of daily life throughout Myanmar. Min Aung Hlaing and the junta have responded to the deep and widespread opposition of the people of Myanmar with barbarism and oppression. Arbitrary detention, torture, and systematic attacks on villages have become the hallmarks of this junta. The military is repeatedly attacking civilian populations throughout the country. In recent months, as the military has lost control of territory on the ground, it has increasingly taken its attacks to the skies. We have seen a significant and steady increase in aerial attacks on civilian targets. Last week, in Sagaing region, or week before last, I should say, an air attack killed over 170 people and approximately 40 children. It seems that the death toll from this attack is increasing as continued strikes continue to prevent victims from accessing medical treatment and more succumb to their injuries. The death toll is rising from that single attack. The numbers associated with the junta's human rights violations are staggering. More than 3,400 people have been killed. More than 17,000 political prisoners are behind bars. More than 1.4 million people have been displaced since the coup. 17.6 million people are in dire need of humanitarian aid. Approximately 60,000 homes, civilian homes, structures like clinics and schools have been burnt to the ground or otherwise destroyed. Nearly half of the country have fallen into poverty. The upcoming G7 summit in Hiroshima offers an opportunity for Japan to shine a light on the situation in Myanmar for the entire world to see. I urge Prime Minister Kishida to ensure that the Myanmar crisis is on the G7 agenda and that a strong, unified message and a commitment to action emerges from that summit. In my conversations over the past 2 weeks, I learned more about the many ways in which Japan is exercising leadership on the crisis in Myanmar and assisting people whose lives have been devastated by the military junta's human rights violation. Japan has strongly condemned the military coup and the junta's atrocities. Japan's generous contributions to humanitarian aid programs have saved the lives of countless numbers of people, while offering shelter, protection, and opportunity to thousands displaced by violence and chaos. Japanese organizations and citizens are fundraising for humanitarian relief efforts and supporting Myanmar nationals adjusting to life here in Japan. Still, more can and more must be done if the downward trajectory of the crisis of Myanmar is to be reversed. I have been honored to engage with Japanese government officials about options to do so. Sanctions. I urge Japan to consider joining all other G7 countries in imposing targeted economic sanctions on the Myanmar military and its key sources of revenue, just as it is doing in response to the crisis in Ukraine. Equipping and sustaining military forces and procuring armaments such as fighter jets and helicopter gunships is expensive. So what the junta sees as its great strength is also a vulnerability. Economic sanctions that deprive the junta of the resources required to operate its war-making machinery would weaken its capacity to attack the people of Myanmar. We know that sanctions can have an impact. Indeed, the democratic reforms that the junta reversed with its coup were made possible at least in part by the imposition of sanctions. The people of Myanmar have been imposing their own citizen sanctions on the regime, boycotting anything and everything connected to the junta. Now they are calling on the international community to join them. But to maximize their potential impact, sanctions need to be imposed by all nations who support the people of Myanmar, and they need to be imposed in a focused and strategic and coordinated fashion. Unfortunately, some nations, including Japan, have chosen not to impose sanctions, and those that have imposed sanctions have failed to do so in a way that adds up to a coherent and powerful whole. If you want to see what this would look like, you need only look at the Japanese government's response to the crisis in Ukraine. While action by the United Nations Security Council was not possible, Japan and a large group of other nations, including all of the G7 members, formed a coalition to take action, including the imposition of targeted sanctions. Frankly, many people in Myanmar have asked me why the response of the international community to the crisis in Ukraine is so different from the response to the crisis in Myanmar. Some have pointed out that the same types of bombs that are falling on the people of Ukraine are falling on the people of Myanmar. I frankly do not have an answer to their question. The junta has made it clear that it intends to seek legitimacy by staging what they will call and hope that the international community will accept as an election. Let me be frank. It is not possible to hold a genuine election when opposition leaders are arrested, detained, tortured, and executed, when key political parties are dissolved, when it is illegal to criticize the junta, and when it is a crime for journalists to do their job. There is no possibility that elections held on the junta's terms can result in a government that enjoys the support of the Myanmar people. Officials from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs told me that Japan's view is that elections held under current condition, without the release of political prisoners, including Aung San Suu Kyi, would create further resentment against the military and make a peaceful resolution to the crisis in Myanmar more difficult. I concur with this assessment and appreciate the government's position on this issue. However, I am concerned that the government has not consistently and publicly stated this position. Additionally, prominent Japanese citizens engaging on issues relating to Myanmar, including a government special envoy, have made statements in support of the junta's fraudulent election plans, creating confusion about Japan's policy. It is essential that the government of Japan and those representing the government of Japan be clear and consistent in rejecting the junta's so-called election. Under no circumstances should Japan provide any support, including technical assistance to the junta, as it carries out this so-called election. To do so would not support or enhance democracy, but rather it would undermine democracy. Japan's military training program. I commend the government of Japan for taking action to stop bringing new recruits, new cadets, and new officers into its military training program for Myanmar military soldiers and officers. And I recommend that the government of Japan terminate this training program altogether. Since 2015, Japan's Defense Ministry has trained Myanmar soldiers in the National Defense Academy and other self-defense forces facilities. Following the execution of 4 opposition figures in Myanmar last year, the Defense Ministry announced that it would no longer admit new trainees from the Myanmar military. However, the Defense Ministry did not terminate the program and continues to train Myanmar military officers and cadets. Government officials with whom I spoke claim that the program instills in participants an understanding of civilian oversight and the role of the military in a democracy, values which they hopefully would take back with them to Myanmar. The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, Myanmar soldiers are not merely learning about human rights and civilian oversight in Japan. They are receiving combat training, and they are learning how to be effective soldiers and commanders. They will not be returning to a democracy, but to a military responsible for crimes against humanity and war crimes. In fact, credible reports have linked the units of previous trainees to atrocities, including massacres and airstrikes against civilian targets. So long as the Defense Ministry continues to train Myanmar soldiers, Japan's self-defense forces will be linked to a brutal military regime. I urge that this program be terminated. Humanitarian aid. Japan's leadership has been evident in the generous provision of humanitarian assistance for millions from Myanmar. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs informed me that the government has provided more than $108 million in humanitarian assistance to the Myanmar people since the coup. In 2022, Japan was one of the largest donors, by far the largest donor in Asia, to the Myanmar Humanitarian Response Plan, which coordinates assistance in Myanmar, and to the Rohingya Humanitarian Crisis Joint Response Plan, which benefits Rohingya refugees who were forced to run for their lives over the Myanmar border into Bangladesh and now live in the largest refugee camp in the world. Unfortunately, few countries have matched Japan's generosity and commitment to the Myanmar people. Humanitarian programs for people in need in Myanmar are woefully underfunded, leading to cuts in life-saving programs. In March of this year, the World Food Program was forced to cut rations for Rohingya refugees by 17% because of a shortage of funds. The Rohingya in these camps are by and large not allowed to work, and their movements are severely restricted. They are almost completely dependent on these food rations for survival. Even before the cuts were imposed, food rations for the Rohingya were insufficient, and the situation for Rohingya refugees was dire. Over 40% of Rohingya children have stunted growth. More than half of Rohingya children are anemic, and this was before the cuts were imposed. A Rohingya mother in the camps told me that even before these cuts, rations for her children were already diminished by the impact of inflation. She was deeply worried that the imposition of these new cuts would mean that she and her husband would have to make the impossible decision of what food to take away from their children's diet. Indeed, I was informed by UN officials that these cuts will do irreparable harm to these children. Rohingya parents with whom I spoke explained that the impact of these cuts is not only hunger and malnutrition, but increasing tensions in the camps and rising incidences of violence. Last year, over 3,500 Rohingya people put their lives and the lives of their children into the hands of human traffickers and smugglers. Hundreds of lives were lost in unseaworthy boats or on perilous land routes. The cut in food rations will almost certainly mean that we can expect even more desperate Rohingya people to perish attempting to escape increasingly perilous conditions. To make this crisis unbearably worse, I have been informed while here in Japan, traveling in Japan, by United Nations officials that food rations for the Rohingya in the Bangladesh camps will likely need to be cut by an additional 20% because of a severe lack of funding, an additional 20%. This will reduce food rations for each individual in these camps to 27 cents per day, 27 US cents per day. Try surviving on 27 cents per day. In fact, I was told that perhaps hundreds of thousands may need to be dropped from the program entirely. Leaving the Rohingya, already victims of genocidal attacks and decades of persecution, to face starvation and yet more violence is unconscionable. These food ration cuts and the suffering they will cause are a stain on the conscience of the international community. It is hard to ask Japan, which has done so much, to do more. But that's what I have done on this mission. I'm asking every member state of the United Nations to consider what resources can be redirected to assistance, to emergency assistance for the Rohingya. Japan has already terminated new official development aid or ODA projects. They've already terminated new projects going to Myanmar. I have asked the government to consider allocating these savings to help address this urgent crisis. I am also asking the government of Japan to use its leadership position to urge and leverage support from other governments, especially Asian governments, that have not supported these relief efforts at all. I commend the government of Japan for suspending official development assistance projects, or ODA projects, a decision that has sent a strong message to the military junta. The government is allowing existing ODA projects in Myanmar to continue. Officials from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs told me that ODA projects are meant to benefit the Myanmar people and that they do not believe that they are enriching the military. Some projects, however, have reportedly resulted in payments to military-controlled companies, including a payment to the Myanmar Economic Corporation for the Bago River Bridge project. I urge the government of Japan to conduct a thorough assessment of the human rights impact of its ODA projects in Myanmar. The government should terminate projects that are found to have an adverse impact on human rights, including by enriching the military junta, or take steps to mitigate such impacts to the greatest extent possible. In the absence of sanctions by the government, Japanese businesses have, by and large, been left to decide whether to terminate or modify their operations in Myanmar, given these current conditions. I met with officials from the Business and Human Rights Policy Office in the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, who told me about the government's new guidelines on respecting human rights in responsible supply chains. This is a positive step, but these guidelines are not binding, and they're insufficient to guide companies through the difficult decisions companies must make in a post-coup Myanmar. I met with leaders from 7 Japanese companies while here in Japan that have invested in Myanmar prior to the coup. Some chose to leave the country following the coup. Others have remained but have suspended their operations. Others left because of economic reasons, and another continues a partnership with a junta-controlled company. What they all had in common was a failure to conduct a thorough assessment of human rights risks and impact prior to entering the Myanmar market. I spoke with the leaders of companies that have made the difficult decision to exit this market, a decision which has had significant implications for their workers, for partners, for their contractors, and their own capital investments. Some cited their own human rights policies as the reason for their decision. I laud business leaders who have acted on their convictions and, as they explained to me, learned from past mistakes. It is imperative that companies exiting Myanmar do so in a responsible manner, minimizing human rights impacts and, to the greatest extent possible, avoiding enriching the military. Creative solutions, including placing shares or property rights into trust or escrow, should be considered. I am deeply concerned about corporations that remain in active partnership with military-controlled companies. I spoke with the leaders of KDDI and Sumitomo, for example, Japanese corporations that are involved in a partnership with the junta-controlled Myanmar Posts and Telecommunications, MPT. MPT not only provides revenue for the junta's military operations, it is directly involved in violating the human rights of the Myanmar people. Leaders of these Japanese companies claimed that they had commissioned an independent human rights due diligence assessment since the coup. They said they could not share that report or its findings because of a confidentiality agreement, and they claimed to be unaware of reports that MPT is being used to conduct surveillance on its customers, to censor information, and to implement internet shutdowns at the direction of the Myanmar military. These shutdowns are known to often be precursors to attacks by junta forces, preventing vital information to get to villagers, including warnings of imminent attacks. If the leaders of these companies are unwilling to end a collaboration that is directly linked to atrocities, then the government of Japan must act. I spoke with leaders from ENEOS and JX Nippon Oil and Gas. Just 2 weeks ago, ENEOS announced that it had completed its withdrawal from a partnership with Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise, a military control company that has been identified as the junta's largest source of foreign currency income. MOGE, M-O-G-E, or MOGE, has been sanctioned by the European Union, and I have been urging member states to also sanction MOGE. Human rights organizations have raised concerns that the exit of these companies could enrich the military and create environmental risk by leaving MOGE solely responsible for the closure of the oil field. The ENEOS and JX Nippon executives told me that they were barred by a confidentiality agreement from providing details about their withdrawal from the partnership, and they declined to offer any details except to say that their withdrawal from the partnership was not a sale. They claimed, however, that upon their exit, they requested that MOGI ensure that funds do not flow to the military, that funds do not flow to the military. Given that MOGI is controlled by the junta, this assertion is frankly absurd. During my trip, I spoke with dozens of Myanmar nationals living in Japan. I listened to the stories of many who sought and received protection in Japan, and also about the challenges they face. The government of Japan's policies have provided safety, security, and opportunity to thousands of Myanmar nationals whose lives have been upended by the coup. Emergency evacuation measures adopted following the coup have allowed Myanmar nationals already in Japan to extend their stay and work in the country so long as the government deems the situation in Myanmar unstable. As of December of last year, nearly 10,000 Myanmar nationals had benefited from this program. I encourage governments in the region and beyond to follow Japan's example and adopt similar policies toward Myanmar nationals. The last thing these people need is to be afraid that tomorrow they could be sent back into the living hell which is Myanmar. Some Myanmar nationals have been recognized as refugees by the government of Japan, receiving permanent resident status. I'm concerned, however, by the long wait times for refugee status determination and the low success rate for applicants. I learned that on average, applicants must wait 3 to 4 years for their cases to be decided. And according to the government, in 2022, only 3.3% of applicants were recognized as refugees. The Immigration Services Agency told me that decisions on refugee status are made according to the Refugee Convention's criteria. But I remain concerned that Myanmar nationals with strong asylum claims will not receive protection as refugees. The government maintains a number of additional pathways for Myanmar nationals to live, work, and study in Japan. In 2022, nearly 1,700 Myanmar nationals were given humanitarian status and allowed to stay in Japan after failing to secure refugee status. Others are receiving visas to work or study in Japan. Japan was the first country in Asia to accept refugees as part of a third country resettlement program. In 2019, Japan doubled its resettlement quota from 30 to 60 per year. The vast majority of those who have been resettled in Japan are Myanmar refugees arriving from Thailand and Malaysia. As of March 2023, 250 people have been resettled in Japan, the majority of whom are from Myanmar. I commend the government for this program, which is yet another example of Japan's leadership in the region. But I urge the government of Japan to greatly increase the resettlement quota given the vast numbers of refugees from Myanmar who are in need of resettlement. Myanmar people living in Japan told me about some of the challenges they face, including difficulties renewing passports, traveling abroad, maintaining employment, registering their marriages, and adjusting to Japanese language and culture. I was told that Myanmar nationals do not receive some of the forms of assistance provided to other populations, such as Ukrainians fleeing the Russian invasion. I raised these concerns with the government of Japan and had conversations with government officials who are committed to improving Japan's policies. Let me conclude. I am extremely grateful for the government of Japan's invitation to travel to this remarkable country and for the open, frank conversations that I have had the opportunity to have with government officials and so many others over the past 2 weeks. I am also thankful for the support and the assistance that Japan has offered to the people of Myanmar. When I announced my mission to Japan, I said, and I quote, as conditions continue to deteriorate in Myanmar, as conditions continue to deteriorate in Myanmar, Japan's leadership in addressing a deepening human rights crisis will be essential. My mission here has reinforced my belief that Japan is well placed to provide vital leadership on the crisis in Myanmar and to use its considerable influence to help end Myanmar's nightmare. I look forward to continuing my engagement with the government of Japan toward the advancement of human rights and justice for the people of Myanmar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that rather dark and depressing statement with some shards of light. Okay, well, I have some questions, but what I'll do is I'll survey the room and throw it open to questions from working reporters first, which is the two tables here, and then from the rest of the room. So if you have a question, can you put up your hand, please? Identify yourself and come to the microphone. どうぞ。そっちの方お願いします。
Thank you very much, sir, for today's opportunity. I work at NHK as a director and producer, and I've been covering Myanmar since 2012 and on and off, and then this time since the coup. So I just have a simple question. Sorry, my name is Ayako Takada. Nice to see you. And question, it's a very simple question, but I want to know the background of your visit. So you said that the Japanese government has invited you to come to Japan and then have all the meetings, but I have a feeling that I have an impression of Japanese government not willing to show you the realities. Like what I heard from my friends and my informants of the Burmese community here, that they met you and had a talk. So I wanted to know the background of the visit and who you met and why you had the impression that the Japan can act better, and where do you want to push more to reinforce this the act of the Japanese government?
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you. Well, I was invited by the government of Japan to come here. As the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of Myanmar, I conduct 2 missions, formal missions per year. I also travel to other countries, sometimes to do lectures and so forth in my other capacity at Yale Law School. But this is one of my official visits. And the reason that this visit is so important, I described, both because of the crisis and the depth of the crisis, and because of the position that Japan is in to positively influence that crisis. So we had very, very good conversations, and I outlined for you in my statement the various divisions within the Japanese government, and I offered them the recommendations that I've been articulating here, and I had, as you point out, I had an opportunity to meet with many from Myanmar, and that is why I reflected both in my comments here today, but also in my meetings with them, some of the questions and concerns that they raised.
Is there any findings, new findings that you think is useful, or like it was informative for you to act further, or because I don't remember very well, but I think that's the first time for you to really include in your statement about the Burmese community in Japan, or their status, or so I just wondered what kind of new findings you had in Japan overall.
Yeah, and what I did was I highlighted in my statement those findings. And I'm not, we'd be here all afternoon if I was to go over every single detail of all of my findings, but I've spoken in great detail with members of the government and other organizations, humanitarian organizations, human rights defenders, and others about their views of the situation and what I think needs to be what needs to be reported.
Yeah, it was surprising to see that you met the leaders of the 7 Japanese companies. That's also that's something we want to dig into also. So it's very encouraging that you did it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, excellent. I mean, maybe that question is sort of hinting at previous rapporteurs when they've come to Japan. I'm thinking of one in particular. The government kind of objected to this finger wagging from a foreigner. You know, they said, "Who are you to tell us what to do?" kind of thing. But in general, the response from the Japanese government was very positive, as far as you're concerned.
Yes, it was very positive. I think that the government of Japan received my recommendations and observations in the spirit to which they were delivered. I'm hoping that they might help the government of Japan continue to provide the kind of service and response that it has as a foundation, but then build on that response to strengthen not only the response from Japan, but the response from the region and from the international community. I think it's extremely important that we stop as an international community, assess what we're doing or not doing, because the fact is the conditions are deteriorating quickly. And it means that we need to reassess our actions and recalibrate given these horrible conditions.
And in terms of specific recommendations, you want Japan as a nation to impose sanctions and for specific companies to desist from operating in Myanmar. Would that be fair to say?
Well, I want the government of Japan to join the other nations of the world in imposing sanctions, even if it means beginning with sanctions on the worst human rights offenders or the worst enablers of these sanctions, because I think we need a coordinated global response, and that's why I mentioned the G7 response to the situation in Ukraine, or the international response, response to Ukraine, as an example. And I know that there are many views on the question of sanctions. But I felt and believe it important to put this recommendation on the table and to discuss it with the government of Japan.
Thank you. I'm just scanning the room. If you have a question, just put up your hand. I see Kitazumi-san. I see the gentleman on top here. Dozo, Kitazumi-san. Onegaishimasu. Do you mind me if I explain that you were... Yeah, so Kitazumi-san is a freelance journalist. He was detained in Myanmar. He was freed.
And, I'm sorry, and when were you detained and when were you freed?
Yeah, I was detained just after the military coup, and detained in the insane prison for 1 month.
Oh.
Yes.
Thank you. Dozo.
Yes. ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much.
For this press conference. So I want to ask you one question about NUG. Hi. Yes.
About what, sorry?
Oh, yes. And you visited the NUG, Japan representative office and make a discussion. So I want to ask you, the first one is your stance to NUG, and also do you have any discussion about with the Japanese government? For example, NUG is demanding more discussion with them to their and also the recognition as a legal government. Yeah, so do you have any discussion with the Japanese government?
Yes, thank you. Yes,
Thank you.
The answer is yes, and I very much appreciate the question. I have been urging all nations, including Japan, all governments, to engage with the National Unity Government, to recognize it as not only a legitimate voice for the people of Myanmar, but as an important resource in being able to help guide policies that impact Myanmar and the people of Myanmar. released a study this past year on the question of legitimacy, including an examination of the legitimacy claim of the military junta. And I concluded that the claim of the National Unity Government to legitimacy is far stronger than the military junta's claim. The NUG, many of those who lead the NUG were elected by the people of Myanmar in the last election. Others are leaders of ethnic states, organizations that represent ethnic states in Myanmar, and they are working tirelessly on behalf of the people of Myanmar from their position in any way and every way that they can. So I urge Japan and all other countries to recognize and engage the National Unity Government as the legitimate representatives of the people of Myanmar and as a trusted source of information and guidance on Myanmar policy.
Thank you very much. That okay?
Thank you very much.
The gentleman at the front, you have a question? Thank you.
I would like to ask you a question in Japanese. Just a moment, please. Can you hear me, Mr. Andrews? Okay. I'm Hara from Kyodo Newswire. So I'd like to ask you a question about Myanmar nationals in Japan, and I have 3 questions. Number 1, in Japan, residency status has been granted on humanitarian basis, but then refugee recognition itself is very, very low for Myanmar nationals. What should be done? That's first question. The second question is about resettlement, and you urged the government of Japan to expand the quota. Right now it's 60, and to what extent it has to be expanded in your opinion? That's the second question. And the third question, and this is as long as you know, right now there is amendment of the Immigration Control Act under the debate in the Diet. And then those applicants of RSD, from the third application onwards, they can be deported back to their home countries. Have you heard about this issue from the Myanmar nationals in Japan? And what are your views on this amendment of the law?
Well, let me say that there are different categories, as I referred to in my comments to immigration. Humanitarian status is one such status. There's another that specifically is focused on the crisis in Myanmar and a recognition of the crisis in Myanmar. And of course, there's recognition of refugee status. Let me say this, that it is imperative that under no conditions anyone from Myanmar be sent back to Myanmar. So any of these options that are available to the people of Myanmar are good options as long as they keep them safe and keep them out of Myanmar. The resettlement program is, on the one hand, it doubled from 30 to 60, but on the other hand, I think 60 is a low number, particularly given the catastrophe that is underway in Myanmar and the great need for people in Myanmar to find safe places to live, including those who have just had to run for their lives to survive. So I would hope that Japan and all countries would consider expanding their resettlement quotas. In terms of the legislation that is being considered making its way through the Diet, I don't know, I don't have the details of this or enough detail to be able to give you a clear and definitive answer, but I can refer back to my initial comments that under no conditions should people be sent back to Myanmar because to do so would put them in great peril. So even if you have gone through the process of applying and then appealing for refugee status, even if you've gone through all of the steps and you have not secured refugee status, you should still be allowed to remain in Myanmar under any of the other provisions, so that you are not put into peril. And I would also urge that careful consideration be made in the future to deciding what are the conditions within Myanmar that would allow or lead to the lifting of that policy or the changing of that policy. Because I think it's very, very important that those who, particularly those who have been outspoken, those who have been leaders of the opposition movement, those that are particularly vulnerable, be recognized for their vulnerability and be allowed to stay in the future.
Thank you. Without knowing the specifics of the amendment to the law that the gentleman was talking about, just question 3, presumably you would be against the kind of a 3 strikes and you're out amendment that would send somebody back. So in other words, the process would end at that point and you would be against an amendment like that.
No one should be sent back to Myanmar. No one.
All right, thank you very much. The gentleman there, and we don't have much time, so if you could keep your questions short and to the point, thank you.
Hi, I'm Genki Ito from Kyodo News Agency, and thank you for your strong message to Japanese people, Japanese government. I have a question. You mentioned about the meeting with the leaders of KDDI, Sumitomo, ENEOS, and JX Nippon Oil and Gas. What was the leaders' reaction? Could you elaborate if possible? Thank you.
The meeting with, to be perfectly honest with you, the meeting with ENEOS and JX Nippon Oil and Gas was a very short meeting. They told me that they couldn't answer my questions. They couldn't give me any details because of confidentiality agreements. So the concerns that have been raised about how companies leave Myanmar, particularly in this particular case, of course, the possibility that you're enriching the junta and the possibility that you're leaving, you're entrusting the safety and security of the Myanmar people in terms of the environmental consequences of these projects to the military junta, which people are telling me very clearly that is not something that should be done. So that companies need to be very concerned about that and to be assured that these projects do not hurt the health and safety of the people and the environment by hurting the people, the environment. So there's not a lot I can tell you beyond that. Now with KDDI, again, there was views exchanged. There was expressions of hope. Let me just some of the specifics that I outlined for you in my statement. I tried to cover exactly what was told to me exactly as I heard them. But in essence, this is deeply problematic. The fact that of all the companies that I spoke with, here you have a company that is not only pouring resources, pouring money into the coffers of the military junta through their profits, their business activities, but they are directly involved in activities that, as I mentioned, are compromising the safety and the human rights of the people of Myanmar. Again, they said they couldn't share the report of their due diligence assessment. They said that they did one. They said it was done by an independent person. or group. They said they couldn't share it because of confidentiality agreements, but they claimed that they were unaware. I think this is important. Not just were they involved in the activities I've just described, but they were unaware of reports that that MPT, who they're working with, is being used to conduct surveillance on its customers, censor information, and implement internet shutdowns at the direction of the military, that they were unaware that MPT was doing this. So that told me all I needed to know about their independent human rights due diligence assessment. Any due diligence assessment that does not recognize what anybody in Myanmar can tell you is not a thorough due diligence assessment of human rights.
Thank you. If I could just ask a follow-up question, if you don't mind. You said on page 6 that you met with business leaders from 7 Japanese companies and that most have left, but you said one company continues a partnership with a junta-controlled company. Was that included in the companies you've just mentioned, or is that a different company?
That's KDDI.
That's KDDI, okay. Just looking again in the room, I see 2 hands. Do you have another couple of minutes? Is that all right?
Sure do.
The gentleman first and then the lady at the back, and I think that'll be the last 2 questions. Thank you.
I know that many of you may be looking forward to getting out of here and beginning your holidays, so I'll try to keep my answers a little briefer than I have.
Thank you very much for your speech, and I'd like to ask about two questions about sanctions. My first question is...
do you want to
Oh, sorry, I'm a reporter with NHK. I'm Yoshimoto Akinori. Thank you. And what would make Japanese government from imposing sanction on Myanmar's junta? And my second question is, EU and other countries has already implemented sanctions, and could you share your review for how effective the sanctions are?
Okay, and I'm sorry, could you give me the first question?
First question. What would make Japanese government preventing from imposing sanctions on? What would the major obstacle for Japanese government to implement
What is preventing the government
Yes,
from?
yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Japan is a G7 outlier in this, is it? Or
That's correct.
yeah, okay.
That's correct. Well, nothing is preventing, in my view. Japan can certainly impose sanctions. It can impose the type of sanctions it wants. It can target those targets that they think are most deserving of sanctions, and could be perhaps the most effective. You know, there are a number of different sanctions regimes in the world, and that's one of the challenges, because very infrequently do these sanctions connect and overlap. So that's one of the. So the first answer to your question is they can certainly impose sanctions, as any sovereign nation can impose sanctions, and I hope they seriously consider it. That's why I'm putting this on the table. But I'm doing so because, not only because of the crisis, but because other G7 countries have responded have been imposing sanctions. Many countries around the world have been imposing sanctions. So we're beginning to build the critical mass that we need in order to have the greatest impact with these sanctions. But what we need is everybody at the table who support the people of Myanmar and are opposed to this military junta stepping up with sanctions that they feel that they're able to impose, and then coordinate those sanctions together so that they end up as a coherent whole, much as has happened in the sanctions in response to the Ukrainian crisis. And I'm sorry,
The second question was how effective are sanctions?
Well, it depends on the sanctions. It depends on the time. It depends on how they're implemented. I believe that in the case of Myanmar, the very reforms that were overturned by this junta were created, that is, elections and new respect for the rights of people to express themselves, and the opening that occurred in Myanmar did not occur because the general suddenly woke up one day and says, boy, maybe we should make Myanmar more open and more democratic and more respectful of human rights. They did it because they felt they needed to do it. And they needed to do it because of international pressure, including economic pressure. And I fully understood the truth of this when the president, Thein Sein, when he was first elected president, came to Washington, D.C. I was there at the time. And the first thing he had to say to the United States government, lift the sanctions. Lift the sanctions. So sanctions, we know, make a difference. And we know that they've led to reforms. And we know that the junta is vulnerable because of the extraordinary expense that they have with this massive military. So we've seen them work. We know that there's opportunity because of vulnerability. And what we need is to at least try these sanctions, given the stakes here, given the horrific situation that's continuing to deteriorate, and given the position of the Japanese government supporting the people of Myanmar.
Thank you very much. And then the final question will be the lady at the back.
I'm Rikako Takada from NHK World, and I have 3 questions, very short 3 questions. The first one is from your mission statement, I understood that Japanese government leave the decision whether to withdraw from Myanmar's business or not. Just having human rights guidelines. Do you think Japanese government and Japanese government is hesitate to impose a sanction? And do you think Japanese government should have more than a human rights guideline? And the second one is, could you name 3 other companies you talked to?
3 other what?
Companies, yes.
Companies.
There are only 4 company names on your mission statement.
All 7 of the businesses that I met with, I can get that. I don't have it right top of my head, but I can get it for you.
Yeah, and the last one is, so you said you got a positive reaction from the Japanese government officials, and what, could you be specific? Like what field do you think we can have improvement from Japanese government?
That is, what were the positive responses?
Yes.
The first question you've kind of answered, right? Should the government move beyond human rights? And you've already said that they should impose sanctions, yeah? So I think we've answered that one. And second one, you don't know, but you'll give the names of the companies later. So the third question.
Maybe I can't count right, but I'll get the balance to you. The positive things. Well,
yeah.
First of all, the discussions were very positive, and even the guidelines, for example, that you mentioned. I mean, they've just begun to establish these guidelines based upon the UN guiding principles for businesses, and so this is a process that's been initiated. And so I think that they're going to continue to develop this process. They gave me every indication that they were committed to this to provide businesses with the kind of guidance and information that would be useful. So I fully expect that to happen. Things like the elections, the question of the elections, and I was a bit confused about exactly where the Japanese government stood with respect to elections. The government, that is to say, in quotes, the orchestration of those fake elections that Min Aung Hlaing is planning. And I received, some very clear indication that Japan has very serious concerns, and they went into detail about this could create more instability, be more dangerous, because if they were done under the conditions that we discussed. So I appreciated that clarity and that concreteness, And I encourage the government to make sure that that position is as clear and as out there as humanly possible, because I think it's really important. Listen, I did, in my years of work in public service, I've done democracy work in a number of countries all over the world. I've helped with parliamentarians and political parties and election officials conduct elections. I've led election monitoring missions. And when a country sees a new election's coming in, they may want to help. They may want to send in staff to help consult and so forth and so on. And so I think that if this were done with respect to Myanmar, the purpose of election assistance, democracy assistance, is to enhance democracy, strengthen democracy, help with these elections. But to do it in the context of this, the military junta's elections and what's happening in Myanmar would be a disaster. It would be legitimizing. It would be a legitimizing gesture to these elections and would be used for propaganda purposes by the junta to try to project legitimacy on very illegitimate, fraudulent elections. So I'm hoping that there'll be clarity with the position of the Japanese government, that they will continue to reflect on what they expressed to me, and that under no circumstances would Japan send any kind of democracy assistance to Myanmar.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas Andrews, for what was a very stark, hard-hitting, and disturbing and rich press conference. Lots to think about. One of the more upsetting things I found out today was that the World Food Programme is shrinking, and it's entirely dependent on donations. I had no idea. It's a very frightening thought that so many people depend on that. Thank you so much. We're encouraged that there is actually a UN rapporteur for civil rights, or for, sorry, I should say human rights in Myanmar. So thank you very much. Do show your appreciation to Mr. Andrews for coming today and sharing his thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tradition. You're welcome.